Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Neil Winward. Neil is the advisor and investor in clean energy, and he also runs a newsletter and is currently writing a book on the thesis AI is writing checks the grid cannot cash. Neil, thank you so much for taking time to chat.
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast, Krish.
My pleasure. Before we get into the topic, we're going to talk many things: AI, energy, and power grids, and a number of things that I'm curious to learn from you in the next 45 minutes to an hour. Before we get into the topic, do you mind giving a quick introduction about yourself and your company to our audience?
Sure. Well, I'm the CEO of Dakota Ridge Capital, and Dakota Ridge Capital works with clean energy developers and investors to help them get their projects built and to make sure that they are able to access all of the government incentives that are available to help them get those projects built and to, if you're an investor, to enhance their investment returns. So my personal background for the last 30 plus years is I trained as a lawyer, as a barrister in the UK. And I decided reasonably early on to exit the law because I didn't want to spend my entire career in a tightly circumscribed part of London. So I entered the world of finance, and I came to the US maybe 38 years ago. And my focus has always been in the structured finance and project finance area. And the transition into renewable energy came around the global financial crisis. I was doing structured finance, and the nature of those tax-based transactions became very much out of favor. And all of the expertise that was developed and built up in that area migrated into renewable energy. In the US, the government has chosen to incentivize those projects by offering generous tax credits. And that, of course, means that people have to have a tax bill that they can offset with those tax benefits. Many energy developers don't have that. So it puts them into partnership with financial institutions, and those financial institutions have a large tax bill typically, and they can and have creatively structured their financings to take advantage of the tax incentives available. And when the Inflation Reduction Act came around, that put that whole business on steroids and made it really easy for corporations to participate, as well as financial institutions, by making it easy to purchase tax credits. So a whole business has grown up around that. And I'm part of that business. And for the last really 3 years, that's what Dakota Ridge Capital has been focused on. I spent 5 years before that building up a tax equity business for a Japanese financial conglomerate, and left there in 23 and started my own business advising developers in the space. And so that's what I've been doing. So that's me, that's the focus, and that's the sort of the background to it.
Thank you so much. It's highly technical. So hopefully, my questions, if they come across as silly, it's not my area of expertise at all. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. And if I ask something that's super obvious, my apologies, Neil. One of some initial questions, just so I digest the breadth of what you do before I can get on the topic. Let's say if you took for our audience to understand, right? Just like from you explain the business, who is your sort of an ideal customer, and what is the type of problem they come to you with, and how do you go about solving that problem? I know you said some part of it already, but if you could just take a simple example, just so we understand both sides of it.
Sure. I'll describe a very recent example. A client is in the clean hydrogen space, and has just finished a project in California, and that project comprises an electrolyzer, which basically takes water and applies electricity to it to break apart the H2 from the O. and produces hydrogen. And that hydrogen then is compressed, chilled, stored, and then dispensed to fleet vehicles who use that as a source of power. So that developer was looking to raise capital from selling a tax credit, or tax credits, actually. So it's an early stage developer. This was the first project. And so we were introduced through a mutual acquaintance, and I essentially orchestrated all of the elements that had to be brought together to put that developer in a position where they could sell that tax credit, which means assembling a team of lawyers and accountants and consultants to make sure that it complied with the various regulations that exist within the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the OBBBA subsequent to that, and make sure that it complied, find a buyer of that tax credit, and then pull the transaction together so that it could close and money could change hands. That's the role that I played.
Okay, perfect. Now, given that my background is basically as a developer, as a software developer, if you will, a lot of how I think, it's just that, when you have a certain skill, you tend to look at every problem from that perspective. So a lot of what I'm going to ask you is at least from where I come from, essentially, right? So you described a problem domain here, right? A highly technical finance related problem, and you have a solution that you're able to offer. Now, just to step out of that zone for a second, Neil, if I were to think of this, if you were to come to me, Krish, I need to help you build software that helps me do X, Y, and Z that relate to this business, there's a certain set of way I would start my questions. And from keeping that in mind, Neil, my very first question to you, you've done this for a number of years. You mentioned, you've got a lot of experience in this space, even before you launched your own company. How were things happening? The problem, two questions. The first two questions are, the problem in itself, the one you're solving, is that new? Meaning this problem did not exist, at least in this form, way, and shape like 2, 3, 5 years ago? Or is the problem domain kind of similar, but the way you're solving this problem, the approach to it, perhaps the tools that you're using, be it in the space of software or outside, is that different? Which of the two is it? Or maybe it's a combination of both.
Well, I think in the project development space, right, for any project, right, anyone who wants to finance a piece of capital equipment that they're going to deploy in a business that's going to increase human productivity with the end goal of producing a product that can be sold, right? That's a problem that's as old as time. Machines are just happen to be the means of increasing human productivity, and technology is a means by which that process of developing the tools is turbocharged, accelerated, and enhanced. So that basic problem set is not new. People operate on the basis, generally speaking, that power comes out of the plug, food comes from the grocery store, and water comes from the tap. There's an enormous amount of stuff that sits behind that, right, to produce all of those things that most people just don't have to deal with. But all of those things required an investment of capital to have the machines to be the wherewithal to produce the goods that people consume. And so it just happens to be that the production of clean hydrogen is one process, the end product being clean hydrogen to sell to fleet vehicles. Now, the problem set is always, how does somebody build the capital stack to finance the project, the machinery that they need to produce that end product? And so there's equity, there's debt, and there's various other incentives such as grants, tax credits, and finding the right blend of those capital ingredients to give the the developer, the business person who's building that machine, the best possible outcome for their business is really what the business is about. It just happens to be labeled, renewable energy or clean energy. That just happens to be the particular label that is attached to that particular problem set. But the end result is you need energy to power vehicles, or um, you need cattle to produce the food. You need to process water to produce the water that comes out of your tap. All of it. There's nothing really new about it, but the techniques for blending the capital together into the right mix are really what it's about. That's sort of my business.
Okay, perfect. So, as we talk about energy, right, the need for energy, one of the things, I pulled up on your newsletter as well, which I'll share in a minute here, which, the picture there is beautiful, the global race for like AI infrastructure. So, one of the things, as somebody who's building software using AI and also, working on building something for the fintech space, I have some awareness to what's happening in the world of finance, not a whole lot, but to some extent. And one of the things I keep reading all the time, Neil, is the demand for energy, right? The incredible demand for energy, because I live in Northern Virginia, and every time I drive outside, I
Right.
see these huge data centers, right? Like massive
Right.
ones. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't believe they are the 1 gigawatt data centers. They might be the 250 megawatt or something along those lines, but they still look
Right.
like huge, right? They're really, really big, for instance.
Right.
So the need for energy has probably, I don't know if it's been more ever in the past, but it's becoming incredibly high, right? I mean, every company, every data center that Meta is opening or building, because someone told me, I talked to somebody who's running a data center. He told me that roughly a 1 gigawatt data center consumes as much energy as 1 million single family homes in the US. I mean,
Right.
that's like insane, right? That's a lot of energy.
Right.
So one of my initial questions, I have a lot of questions. One of my initial questions to you, Neil, is the need for energy and the demand for it dramatically increasing. Does it have any impact on the core nature of your business, or is that orthogonal to what you do?
No, it does very much so. I mean, I think it's, if you just look at the size of the interconnection queue, right? Every generation resource, every nuclear plant, every wind farm, every solar farm, actually has to connect that generating source to the grid in order to supply power to someone, right? To some load. And so what's happening is let's say the US has at the moment 1,200 gigawatts of generating power as a country, right? That's what the US has. There's 2,300 gigawatts of generation that is waiting in the queue to be connected to the grid. And that means that, that source has to be studied. How much power is it going to generate? Which part of the grid is it going to connect to? Which load is going to be connecting to it? What time of day requirements are needed, et cetera, et cetera. And so, that's a huge pent up demand, and or a supply, I should say. And there is definitely enough demand to take that. And so your particular area in Virginia is a massive data center hub, right? There's a massive amount of power. And PJM, which is the ISO that is responsible for that territory, is in a critical phase of having too much demand, not enough supply. And so the impact on my business is that there are lots and lots of developers who are looking to supply their generation source to the grid, and there's demand for their projects, and they need to get financed, but the the ability to connect up all those generating sources with all of the loads that need that power is highly constrained by the physical infrastructure that exists to sort of plug them into each other. So you have, NVIDIA, for example, selling its GPUs to get installed in data centers that have been built and yet cannot connect to the grid. They're dark, essentially, which is a wasted resource, right? And so you have this crazy situation where, because all of the permitting associated with connecting source of power with demand for power, because all of those steps are so complex, right? If you think about it, if you want to get permission to build a high voltage line across the country, you're crossing a number of zoning and permitting regimes, and those processes take a long time, many, many years. It's not like that in China, for example. They can build out this very quickly, and they've built as much generation as we have as a country in the last 5 years because they're not encumbered by multiple permitting regimes. So it impacts my business in as much as there is a lot of pent up demand for the capital formation that is needed to get all of that done. So it's a massive area of focus.
Wow. So what are given that, right? And to the extent I do, and to the extent I understand that in terms of those needs, essentially, you're one of the articles that I mentioned that where you had this beautiful
Yeah.
picture, of the map with all the regions essentially, and the title is the coming AI power shortage. So we hear of that all the time. You talked a little bit about the demand and the supply here, Neil, but the need for energy is increasing dramatically, right? Do we have, I mean, given all the different sources of energy, right, the different varieties, if you will, of how that energy can potentially come from, do we as a country have that much energy to be able to power these data centers, all these AI specific data centers who are generally very power hungry, right? I mean, is there a situation where there is not enough power that we need, or is that not a problem? Is there enough energy for all of these data centers?
There isn't enough power in the right place at the right time. The challenge is not so much you can build power. So West Texas, for example, is blessed with a huge amount of wind and solar, but it's been pretty good at building the transmission infrastructure. ERCOT, which is the zone in which Texas sits, is one permitting authority for the whole of Texas. And it's been pretty far-sighted in building the infrastructure it needs to move power from one place to the other. But still, there's more generation capacity in West Texas than there is transmission pipes to get it from West Texas, where the population is not dense, to all of the load centers, such as Austin, Houston, Dallas, Corpus Christi. Those are the load centers, and they're not where the power is being generated. So, do we have enough power? We do have enough power, but we don't have enough pipes able to move that power from where it can be generated to where it's needed. And that's generally the case across the country. For example, you may have read that the Trump administration is considering a waiver for the Jones Act, right? Why? Why would it do that? Well, because we generate an enormous amount of natural gas in Houston. It's a byproduct to a lot of the fracking that goes on. And so it's very cheap in that part of the country. It's needed in the load centers, in California and especially in the Northeast. But the most efficient way to move it from Texas to the Northeast would be to put it onto a ship and have the ship sail around or sail through and deposit that in the Northeast. But the Jones Act requires that those ships be U.S. built, U.S. flagged, and U.S. operated. And the reality is that the ships that are available to move gas in scale are not built in the U.S. and they're not operated by U.S. crews. And so, and that was sort of the Jones Act constraint. And so you have this shortage of something that is abundant in Texas, in the Northeast, which is crazy. But that is a great example of a larger problem which exists. So to answer your question, we may have enough generating capacity, but we don't have the infrastructure to move it from where it's generated to where it's needed.
Wow. Okay. Again, based on some of what I know, you clearly know 1,000 times more than I do in this space. So again, thanks for humoring some of my basic questions here, and I appreciate it. One of the articles I read recently was, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA. I don't know if he blogs much. I can't remember the last time I stumbled into one, but there's something that he blogged about recently, which was, it was kind of all over the place. I think if I remember correctly, it was titled AI is a 5-layered cake or something along those lines. And then he has each, he writes about each of those layers, and no surprises. The very first layer is energy, where he tries to say that, or he does say that the foundation of just about everything they are doing is energy, right? Without those needs, I mean, there is more layers on top. It's infrastructure. There's these companies that are in the AI software companies, and there's other things that make up those 5 layers. But the very first and the most essential of those layers, not that the rest are unimportant, but the starting point is energy. So as we talk about AI investments, companies spending hundreds of billions of dollars, especially the hyperscalers, on AI compute and these data centers, we're going to have an increasing need for this, right? And there's different ways. I think I read something not too long ago where Starlink, I think Elon Musk's company, is going to probably have energy generated in space or something along those lines, right? These things are like way above my level of understanding.
Right.
But the reason I mention all of them is collectively put some of what I said there together. The need is there, the demand is there, and then it comes back to someone like you who's running a company, right? Say a business that's in that space essentially. So one of another perhaps maybe silly, maybe not a question is, a lot of what you're doing there, like, on where you mentioned you're able to connect investors to investing in these energy projects. Are there projects where these companies that you work with, investors, Neil, that want to invest in, but you figured that, hey, you know what? As much as there is this need for energy and there is a demand, maybe this project is not a good one. Maybe it's not a viable one versus something else, which probably has a lower return on investment, but maybe is a higher, a better project for those investors to invest in. Are there things of that nature, or is every
Sure.
project just as good from an energy standpoint?
No, every project is not created equal. That's for sure. So you're getting to a really core question, which what makes a project investable? And so you need to have a developer who is capable of bringing it from the drawing board to actual physical completion. And that's not a small task when you look at some of the the complexity of assembling a project, right, with all of the hard costs that go into it and all the soft costs that go into it. So you have to have a very high level of competence in the developer and their ability to articulate their level of competence, plus that they have penciled out a project that makes sense, that they have figured out how they're going to get it paid for, that what the revenue sources are available to it once it's built, is really important to be able to find investors and lenders who are prepared to back that project. So, that's a set of skills which has to be evaluated by people like me, and having spent 30 plus years evaluating all different kinds of businesses, I have a good sense of who is credible, what they've done, whether they can do what they're planning and advertising that they're going to do, and whether they can be capable of raising the capital needed to get it done. So all of that is not really something that can be, you can't plug that into your favorite AI tool and say, is this viable? I mean, you can go a long way. You can pull together a ton of the material that developers pull together. And it makes it quicker to evaluate things such as independent engineering reports and and various studies that have been put together to evaluate the opportunity. But the soft skills of understanding and evaluating how all of that hangs together and whether it's credible are not something that lies in the judgment category. So that's sort of the special sauce, so to speak.
You kind of read my mind there, Neil. We are kind of halfway through this. We've talked a bunch about energy. I want to take the conversation to the next part of it, which is a little bit closer to where I live from an engineering standpoint. And let me start with this first question, which is, you kind of answered it already when you finished it, but I want to talk a bit more about that. A lot of what you've told us in the last 20-25 minutes, right? It's very rich in nature from a subject matter standpoint, right? You need to understand this. It clearly tells us that, hey, Neil's been doing this a long time. He's very smart and he's got this experience and awareness of what's going on in this space. Now, I, keep that in mind for a second, and I speak to it from my standpoint. I've been building software for like 20-25 years, right? The nature of software, the languages, the frameworks, the industry, a lot of that changes all the time. But the fundamentals do not change necessarily, right? For the most part, building good software that scales, it's got the least number of bugs and whatnot. Now, when people come and tell me, Krish, code can be generated and is being generated more and more these days. It's a whole lot cheaper to write code. You don't need a developer anymore. A lot of that is true, but not entirely so. And I have a certain response to them as to why there is a need for certain kinds of roles, why some roles have changed. I want to kind of ask this question back to you. And the context I gave you at the top of this 2-minute ramble, if you will, was, Neil, that you explained a lot about energy, the needs, the demand, and the company, the sector that you work in. The experience that you bring, the soft skills, and beyond that as well, is incredibly important for the success of any project that you work on, right? I mean, hands down, because if someone told me to solve the problem that you're trying to solve there, as somebody who has absolutely no clue, I would ask these questions, rely on Claude or ChatGPT to help me or guide me through the process. And maybe it's going to answer some questions, but without me knowing head or tail about energy, the need, the demand, the industry, I would be like, it's just, I don't know what the right idiom is. I'm sure there is a good idiom for this. I'm not convinced I would even be asking the right questions or doing the right sort of things, even with AI prompting and prodding me along the way. But people have this recurring question. The tool is doing a lot these days. You don't need the people who've done this long enough to even be part of this team or this company. I want to get your thoughts, given your industry, sort of playing the devil's advocate, right? If somebody said, hey, you know what? Neil's got all of this experience that's extraordinarily rich, but I cannot afford to hire Neil, just hypothetically. So I'm going to rely on ChatGPT to guide me through this process. What are your thoughts on something like this, Neil? What are the pros and cons, and where do you think, if there is a space where this thing is going to fall flat or really short, what might those scenarios be?
So I have a good friend who does code, right? He's built a number of businesses, and sold those businesses, and now he's using Claude Code to write code. I think most recently to write an accounting system for clients, right? A GL sort of a tool. And he says he spends all day, having Claude code for him, but what he's really doing is supervising. He's supervising agentic processes, and because they make mistakes and they go off on the wrong direction, and so he has to bring them back and redirect and make sure they're doing the thing right. I think it's it's no different than when I had a team of people who were doing various things, such as building pitch decks, such as running financial models to evaluate different scenarios relative to a project, digging into data rooms, pulling out information, analyzing that for the purpose of presenting it for an investment committee proposal. And all of that is a lot easier to do now. I don't have to write fancy code. I can just have Claude be in my Excel model and have it do a bunch of stuff, which takes out one analyst for sure. But I have to supervise that. I have to first of all, say, look, this is what we need to get to. This is how a deal works. This is how the capital structure should work. This is how, the tax credits are calculated relative to an eligible basis of capital investment. Now, what I want you to do is to look at this and be like, oh, I'll do that. No, not that. You haven't quite got it yet, right? This is what I need you to do. Oh, I think I've almost got it. Not quite. Oh, okay, good. Now you've got it. Now I need you to run, 10 different scenarios. Boom. It can go off and do that and evaluate it. And then I can speak to my client and say, hey, look, this is what we need to bear in mind in order to be able to get this done. This is how we need to proceed. And we can't go and speak to whoever it is that we need to help us get to the next step until we've figured this out, until you have done this, because they're going to ask you, well, has the developer done this? Have they found this? Have they got this permit? Have they got this report? If you haven't got those, they're not going to move forward. I know that because I know how these people operate, right? So that's the same as you knowing that if you write code in a certain way and send it off to do a certain thing, it's going to make mistakes unless you focus it appropriately on the task and define that task for it. And then it can run happily. If not, it's going to meet a roadblock and it's going to have to come back and ask for further instructions. And so all of those elements of judgment that go into knowing how to find the most expeditious path from where you are to getting what you want, which in this case, in my case, is the capital provider to provide the capital that the developer needs to go ahead and complete that project. All of those things are an accumulation of knowledge based on knowing everybody in the chain and what they need to meet the requirements that they're going to have in order to get to where you need them to get to. So it's that knowledge which is really hard to reproduce because it doesn't exist at the moment. I mean, I'm not sure that it won't, by the way, exist. I think if I could upload myself to an agentic AI overlord, I could probably do that, and it could probably then internalize everything that I know and be able to use that to get to a result. But then somebody would need to know the questions to ask. So that's kind of, it's not a complete answer because I feel
No, it is
confident it's going to
actually. I was going to
change.
say you articulated that extremely eloquently. I'm just going to summarize that in my own words, if you will, but thank you for that answer. So, is it fair to say, Neil, then the crux of what you're saying there is you treat those tools sort of like a junior developer, right? Haley, you know what? I want you to do this, see what you can produce. I want you to do this, what you can produce. it's not one junior developer, maybe it's 10 junior developers, or maybe it's 100 junior developers, but regardless, you are giving the instructions, right? Prompting it to doing things based on the richness of your experience. And where it falls short or does something differently or can start hallucinating and whatnot, you make those tweaks and adjustments, but you're only able to do that because you've done this a dime a dozen times, right? And you have this experience. But if you had the exact same tool and gave it to me, I wouldn't be able to produce anywhere near the same outcome because I have no idea. I'm going to have to rely on the tool in itself to tell me what to do and have turn around and have another set of tools do what I was told should be done by this other tool. And if that initial set of tools did not do their job well enough, then the rest of my time is wasted, right? I'm interacting with the other set of tools that don't make sense. I mean, is that
Right.
is that like a
Yeah. No,
reasonable
that's
summary?
true. It's not necessarily just a junior developer. It might be a senior tax lawyer, right, who's charging $1,000 an hour. And I don't have to call that tax lawyer and ask a question about how does this work. Knowing roughly what I'm looking at in the legislation, I can put the question into Claude and say, go find me the 5 criteria that this project needs to meet to pass the test that is set out in this part of the legislation, and give me a risk analysis of the particular set of facts that I'm dealing with as it fits into that analysis. Now, that's quite a complicated question, but that is a question that AI can really answer, because there are precedents out there, there are papers written, there are court cases, there's legislation, there's treasury regulations, there's private letter rulings, and it can go and poll all of that information if directed appropriately and come back and give me a crisp answer that I might even be able to summon on a phone call with a client who asks that question. And so the resource is remarkable. So what does that tax lawyer do? Well, there's some layer of judgment that is needed at the point where the AI comes back and says, this is a complex analysis, and it's this is the aggressive end, this is the conservative end. Where you are on that spectrum is something that a tax lawyer can give you. And so, when you call them up, eventually, you have a very, very specific and focused question. And so, but equally, you wouldn't be able to do that. Krish, you wouldn't be able to do that, just as I wouldn't be able to know how to go into, code up something that you're doing.
No, makes sense, right? So that takes me to the next part of our conversation, a little bit about technology, right? So you mentioned your business, the problems, and the value add that you bring to the table, Neil. Uh, my first question is, what are some of the tools that you currently use, right, to make your life better, right? It could be, I mean, are those tools, again, if you are using a bunch of tools, do you build them in house? Like maybe it's, how does this whole interaction work? In other words, somebody's got money to invest in this energy, in an energy project, and there's somebody who's doing something in that space, a developer. You need to bring them together and help them all the way through. So there is a workflow in place, right? For somebody like me who does not understand this, my first thought process would be there is a sequence of steps that needs to happen, maybe some in parallel, some in serial. So we can start there. Like, are there some tools that you use to have you get started? Like, how do either of these parties onboard onto the Neil system? Is that something they do through a web application, or how does that initial conversation work from a technology standpoint?
I think from a technology, let's sort of back up a little bit. Let's assume that we've gone through the step of them deciding that they want to hire me, right? And we've agreed the commercial arrangement. Then the first step is surely going to be that they will admit me to their data room. If they don't have a data room, they have to build a data room, and they have to have basic documents in that data room that credential the project from the point of view of someone like me and anyone else who looks at it, that they've been through the relevant permitting with the local authorities that are required to sign off on them having their project built, in that they have a series of, that they have a sort of a spreadsheet that encapsulates the line items of all of the things that go into that project that can then be audited by third parties, that they have a financial model that can be validated, that the equipment cost is something that can be validated. The soft costs are something that can be validated. So I'm going to need to look at all of that, poke through the data room, and then build a mental picture of the substance of what they're doing, and the financial credentials of what they're doing. And so that's really me going through the data room. I may use an AI tool to help me speed through that data room. If there's like 1,000 pieces of paper relating to permitting, it'd be handy to be able to upload those PDFs and then say, tell me, that end-to-end process is what will be expected in this particular location. But it's really building that mental picture of a substantially constituted project. The financials of the...
But Neil, just to interrupt you there, right? Everything that you mentioned the last 3 to 4 minutes, is that happening on a piece of software, an application, or is it mostly emails and conversations going back and forth?
It will be. I mean, there are emails and conversations, but the data room exists in one of a number of different data room tools, right? Box would be one example. That's a pretty good data room tool. So that's a portal access tool that enables somebody to effectively onboard their understanding of a project, right? And then
you're talking about box.com, where you're uploading documents, essentially,
correct.
right?
Yeah.
But that's to me, but Neil, that's like, I create a folder, like say there, and I have you upload a bunch of documents. That doesn't necessarily guide the process per se, right? You know what I mean? There is a certain workflow here. I'm just, in my mind as a layman, imagining a page with the workflow where there's a bunch of boxes, right? Whatever. It says start here, like Neil's onboarded onto the project, and then the right end of it, this is now complete. And I now know what is happening at any given point of time. Is that not how it works? It's mostly happening outside of these tools per se?
Yeah, mostly. And I think there are companies, that exist to provide a more regimented workflow. And they do exist. I mean, there's one called Banyan Infrastructure, which provides that exact set of workflows that you've described. But I would say for the most part, it's really using the library of information that's stored in a data room.
And I can tell you the reason why I'm asking you that, right? Because in the 5 layers of the cake that Jensen Huang mentions in their blog that I mentioned, at the end of that, one of the layers, we start with energy, and the very last layer is the AI software layer per se, right? And then now in the last 6 to 9 to 12 months, you probably know just as much as I do, a lot of the SaaS companies have taken a beating, right? I mean, Salesforce, what is it? Workday, Monday, Team, Asana, I can think of ServiceNow. A lot of these software companies have lost like 2/3 or 1/2 of their market value, because everyone's like, there's AI is here, so we don't have the need for these other businesses. That's not true. A lot of people have said that that's not true. The market's not come to terms with it, and it's penalizing these companies. I've heard Jensen Huang say it more than once, and other people say it. And I'm not saying this because we as a company are also in the space of SaaS, right? I mean, we do provide our APIs, you can pay by use. I can see that there is a certain value that each of these companies, including ours, brings to the table. But the market, there is a market disconnect there. And I mentioned that because, Neil, everything that you just said there in terms of the process of onboarding and doing things, you mentioned there is a company that does it, but it looks like to me that there are other, not everybody is using these tools to getting things done. So can we then say that the demand, even for the work that you're doing in the business that you are in, do you actually see a need for software and applications that you wish that, oh my God, I wish this was there, it could make my life easier, that does not exist? Which means if that is to be the case, then a lot of us are okay as software companies and SaaS companies. But if you don't see that need, then there's a real problem. So I want to sort of get your thoughts on, when you're going about your business on a daily basis, do you find that you need these tools and applications that somehow don't seem to yet exist, that you
No,
actually think that need to be there?
no, I don't. And in some ways, I I experience this as um, I've over the years, CRM software, right, has been something that has periodically been sold to financial services professionals. And, there's been some uptake, but I can tell you that investment bankers could care less about CRM software. They just they couldn't, right? Their primary focus is clients and deals and providers of capital. And if you can persuade them that a software tool will help them pull that together quicker and more efficiently, then they'll believe. But if you're telling them that management needs them to use this software so that they have a paper trail of what they're doing, they will hear that primarily as, oh, so that you can ultimately write our jobs out of the picture, right? Now that isn't really the case. I would say the tools that I have come to value massively are tools that enable the basic process that I follow to be done quickly and more efficiently, but that involves preparing presentation material, you know, creating and manipulating and analyzing financial models, and accessing and storing, for ease of access, information that I need to be able to, move the project along. And so, all of the people that are involved in the process that I'm involved in need those tools too. And the it's not sort of a flow business in the same way that some parts of the financial business are, like trading equity derivatives or over the counter financial products. Those lend themselves to systems and software. What I'm describing really doesn't. I mean, it just doesn't.
Makes sense. We have like about 10, 12 minutes to go.
Sure.
I've asked you a lot of questions. I have a couple of more to ask, a few more, I think, but I want to take a break here and he'll ask you if you have any questions to ask me.
So I am curious why you decided to expand your area of coverage for the podcast into stock trading. I think it's a fairly sort of the basic level of discussion, but I'm curious about why you decided to do that.
Yeah, I can tell you. So, just by way of background that I shared with you before we hit record, our company, we have a few different products, right? Like B2B products, like APIs that I mentioned, and then B2B, B2C products is we have project management application that you can use to to manage all kinds of projects essentially. And we have an education platform as well, right? So we are a product company with a few different products. Finance was not one of it, right? But as we build our APIs, the idea behind us publishing our APIs, Neil, on AWS Marketplace, or even selling them as commercial licenses, is if you're building
Hmm.
an application today, like a web app or a mobile app or a microservice or whatever it is that you're building, if you were to use the AI tools that are available today and integrate our APIs, the Snowpal APIs, you can build whatever it is that you're building a whole lot faster, right? With the advent of AI, you don't need as many people as you needed in the past. The role structures have also changed in software organizations. So you don't need to staff all of your people. You don't need backend teams essentially if you integrated our APIs, right? That's why we are publishing our APIs. Now we have a bunch of them published already. The next one we are working on, as I mentioned to you quickly, is a fintech API. So to be able to build that API, we want to understand the pain points of what some things are that are actually lacking as a retail investor who's going to invest in the stock market. Maybe as a day trader, maybe as a short-term investor, or maybe even as a long-term investor. Now, I've been doing this part-time as an investor like a lot of us are over the years, but never did it full-time. So some of us in the company have taken time to experiencing the market, the pain and the joys of the stock market. It's been mostly pain lately, but hopefully you have both sides to it. And to do that, to build this API, we needed to spend that time. And as we spend that time, we have some learnings that we've not had in the past, right? About industries, about sectors, about companies within an industry, what these financial ratios are, what metrics we need to look at. I mean, if you're doing this in Wall Street, you probably have $30,000 a year tools like Bloomberg terminals and whatnot, right? So you have all the information available to you in like microseconds and milliseconds. But the
Hmm.
average retail investor does not have that. And as I talk to kids who graduate from college or even young adults who are in the workforce, they are putting money in the stock market, right, trying to invest, but their knowledge or awareness of what's happening is incredibly low from my understanding and awareness based on these conversations. So we started to share some of our learnings. Now, we are not experts in any area for that matter, but the little that we learn, we wanted to share it. So we expanded our podcast from it being purely software engineering oriented to covering finance, because there is an interest in maybe geopolitics, maybe micro and
Mm.
macroeconomics and whatnot. And I personally have an interest in that space. And since we're building the API as well, it seemed like, what, why not have those conversations? And we've had some people show up and educate us more about that space as well. So that's kind of the loosely
I see.
defined answer, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. No, I think it's obviously it's fascinating because I've used tools to analyze my own investing, right? I was to look at all the trades that I've done in a year, tell me, evaluate it from the point of view of a chief investment officer evaluating their portfolio and explaining it to their limited partner investors, and so it's kind of an interesting exercise to go through, using that sort of prospectively to guide your investing or trading. I think is an obvious way of doing that, and there's been all sorts of different applications, high frequency trading, trying to reduce latency, and so on. So there's a ton of money that's gone into that precisely because there's a ton of money to be made. So I was curious about but it makes sense. I think if
Yeah,
you're
and then
building,
the tools that we use, right? Let's say, for instance, we use a number of platforms like Fidelity and E-Trade and
right,
whatnot. They've not changed, at least to a retail investor, Neil. They've not changed much over the years. Now, the backend systems may have changed. I don't know,
right,
but as somebody who's using those platforms, I was like, oh my god, I've been using them for like a decade or maybe 2 decades or more, and they've
right,
changed ever so slightly, and there's so many gaps that need to be filled there. And we are hoping, so far, we've not had the need to raise money. We are a bunch of developers, we build software, but building
right,
fintech software is more expensive because the exchanges are very expensive. The annual subscriptions are quite a bit of
Sure.
money. So
Yeah.
while we're trying to figure out how to build this with or without raising money. We are not spending too much time trying to raise money, but we might have a need for that as well, because a lot of these, I talked to the exchanges in New York. I learned that there's more than one exchange, for instance, and the data could be coming from different exchanges, and all the rules and regulations around finance and governance and the government, regulations and whatnot, has been very overwhelming to a software team, to be honest with you, right? So we're trying to
Right.
wade through some of those challenges before we can start spending all of our energies in building the actual software per se, right? So that's sort
Okay.
of where we are at. Any other
Okay.
questions?
No, that's fine. Go ahead if you have some more.
Yep, we got like 4 minutes left. Couple
Okay.
questions to end. One of the questions is completely unrelated to our conversation. I'll come back to a relevant question. What is your ideal dinner? If you go out to dinner, you don't have to worry about how much money you're spending. What would be your order for an appetizer, for an entree, and a dessert? And they don't have to all be part of the same cuisine. It could be 3 different cuisines or the same one, it's left to you. But what would your order be for an appetizer, for an entree, and for dessert?
Yeah. So I'm going to go with one cuisine because it's a cuisine that that I often enjoy. So I would start off with for appetizer. I would sort of go for pani puri, if you're familiar with that.
I'm going to explain to our audience, or I'm going to have you explain, Neil. Sorry, can you tell? Not everybody knows this.
You go ahead and explain. It's a South Indian vegetarian sort of delicacy.
I'm going to make a small correction there, just so people are not upset. It's North Indian, right? It's from the north of India.
It's North Indian. I beg your pardon. I think what would I love? The dosa is a really I love that. Rava dosa would be a great sort of a great main course. For dessert, firni, which is kind of like a rice pudding type of a.
No, sorry. Say that again. What is that?
Firni.
Is that an Indian? Is that an Indian dessert?
Yeah, it is. Okay. It is. Yeah, sort of like a saffrony rice pudding type of a thing. So that would be a great meal. I that make me very happy. And but there's many different types of Indian cuisine.
You got me hungry already. I'm a vegetarian.
There you go.
And everything that you mentioned there is vegetarian. I Perfect, like that. Right? So it sounds like. I'm just going to ask you for the dessert one more time. How do you spell it, if you don't mind?
I think it's either Phirni or Firni.
Okay, I'm going to look that up.
Yeah, check it. I may have misspelt it.
No, India is very diverse. It's probably from a certain part of India that I'm not aware of, probably, right?
Yeah,
that's amazing. That sounds like a good dinner. Pretty light dinner.
No, it is. It's and I can never quite understand why it takes so long to make a rava dosa versus a different kind of a dosa. But I've had explanations. I just haven't remembered them. But I think
it's one of the things. But it's fair though. It's fair because sometimes they tell you the wrong answer. But this one I can corroborate that it actually does take a whole lot longer to make it. Which is why if you go to, I don't know if I know one of the places. You said you were in New York, right, Neil? So I know one place that if you want to have great Indian food, I mean, this is my opinion, by the way, right? If you want to have the best Indian food, you've got to be in India. But let's say you can't travel that far. The next recommendation I say is go to Singapore. Singapore's got probably the best South Indian food that you could find. And it's super clean as well. So that's great. And if you can't go that far either, go to Asia. You have to go to UK. I think UK has some incredibly genuine Indian food, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to even explain, right? Anything but
my wife is Malaysian, right? So she's half Indian, half Chinese. So we've been to Malaysia many times, and Malaysian food is just that remarkable
Neil,
blend
it's kind of funny.
of Chinese
My
and Indian.
my wife is Malaysian. She's Indian Malaysian, right? So she
Okay.
makes everything she makes in the house is a combination of Malay, Chinese, and Indian food all the time.
Right,
So
right,
it's kind of
right.
an incredible coincidence that your
Perfect.
wife is also
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, perfect.
Amazing. This is awesome. I genuinely enjoyed chatting and learning many things, energy from you, Neil. I'm sure the audience as well. Uh, if you don't have any other questions, if you could just have the closing comments and then we can
Yeah,
call it
so
wraps. And if you could just stay on the call after that as well.
yeah, so I would say, you referenced it a couple of times, the report that the AI grid report that I mentioned, which is you had a nice visual from that.
I'm going to share it here. Yep.
Okay. Yeah,
Go
that's
ahead.
the one. That's exactly it. So all of your listeners, this newsletter is going live on April 7th. And the two other newsletters that I write, Macro Mashup and Fearless Investor, are going to be paused for the cadence of that is going to be paused for a little bit. And this is what I'm focusing all my energies on. So that's going to come out weekly. It's going to accompany a book that I'm writing on the on the grid. The grid is a story and the prices and that. So it really is focusing on this massive disconnect between the speed at which we anticipate the compute to be rolled out and AI to be rolled out, and the speed at which the infrastructure to get it get it realized is going to be rolled out. And I think it's a huge challenge. We're going to be pulling live data from all of the load balancing authorities around the country every week about the state of the queue, the pressure on the different components of the grid, the variables that go into making that and delivering the power to the plug. So it's something that you should take a look at. Subscribe to your listeners should take a look as well, because it's going to be incredibly revealing, and there's nobody else out there that's doing that yet.
Thank you so much, Neil. Again, folks, our guest today was Neil Winward. We'll include the links to dakotaridgecapital.com, Neil's LinkedIn profile, and his newsletter, so folks can certainly subscribe to it.
Perfect.
With that said, Neil, thank you very much for taking time. Much appreciated.
You're welcome.